Welcome to Session 5 of the Crazy Patch Block of the Month. In this session, we will be manipulating the striped fabric in your kit before it is cut and pieced into your Crazy Patch blocks. Included with your instruction sheet are 2 templates. As you can see, I've traced multiple copies of the templates onto freezer paper so that I can show you the layout of the stripe and the positioning of the templates on your fabric. As noted in the instructions, the stripe in your kit is not a balanced stripe. There is a repeat, but it's not symmetrical from side to side. Therefore, we will need to cut all of our triangles facing the same direction. Look carefully at the repeat on your fabric. You will see that there is a large floral stripe as well as a smaller version of a similar floral stripe. I've decided to place the base of my template on the solid blue line that is just to the left of the larger version of the floral stripe. I'm going to be cutting out each of these templates with seam allowance on all sides. Therefore, I've spaced the templates accordingly so that I have room for my overcuts and seam allowance. I found that I can cut 6 large triangles from this fabric, which will allow me to assemble 1 1/2 squares to use in my pieced blocks. I'm going to use the scraps of this fabric to cut 8 pieces using template B. I'm going to have to be very careful about how I position these pieces to cut all 8 from the same piece of fabric. Once you've stitched the triangles into the basic shapes, it's time to cut out the block templates. Use the freezer paper patterns that have been provided in your kit and position them on the pieced fabrics so that you can cut out your templates. Remember to allow for seam allowance on all sides. As you can see, this technique will use quite a bit of fabric, and we want to have as little waste as possible. So, once the initial templates have been cut, I'm going to use my seam ripper to open up this seam and separate these 2 pieces of fabric. I want to save these 2 miters that I've created, so I'm going to repiece it back together again, like this. This will be an interesting detail in my piece, but as you can see, once I've taken the seam allowance, this template will be too large. So, part of Crazy Patch is learning how to deal with situations like this. I'm going to insert a piece of fabric from a previous block. This is from block number 4. And once I've taken the seams and repieced this together, you can see that I'll easily be able to cut number 1 from that piece. And I'll have 2 interesting miter details in this one piece. Now that my individual blocks have been assembled, you can see that all the prep work we did, mitering the stripe and creating the spiderweb design, adds considerable interest to the blocks. These little details are what make Crazy Patch more interesting. I know that many of you are anxious to get to the embellishing portion of this project. However, I suggest that you wait until you have all of the individual blocks assembled so that you can distribute the color across the entire quilt top. But if you're planning to embellish by hand, I do understand your desire to get to that process as soon as possible. As you can see from the layout diagram that was included with your instructions, we will be assembling the pieced blocks in groups of 4. Once those larger blocks have been stitched together, I recommend that you back them with a piece of flannel. This will help support the stitches and hide your carrying threads if you're working by hand. It's also going to help balance the weight of the pieced work with the velvet sashing that we'll be adding later. After 4 blocks have been joined together, as I have here in our sample, you can embroider on the seam lines by hand or machine. I suggest that you have your embroidery go from side to side or outside edge to outside edge so that the ends of your threads are trapped in the seams when we add our sashing pieces later. Use your decorative stitching to help blur the lines between the individual blocks by traveling randomly from block to block. Although this sample has had beads added to it, I highly recommend that you refrain from doing any handwork that involves a hard object before the entire quilt top has been assembled. Any beads or hard elements that have been placed too close to the seam lines will interfere with the assembly of the final top. This month's packet also includes the first of your border patterns. These are to be assembled in the exact same way as your Crazy Patch blocks. The pattern has been pre-printed for you on freezer paper. Once you've assembled the pieces, you can square these to measure 5.5 inches by 10.5 inches. There will be 5 total patterns in your block, and this month you are to make 5 of them. Use any of the fabrics from any of the blocks to assemble these pieces. And should you have scraps that are not quite large enough to cut the piece, feel free to sew 2 or more pieces together in order to be able to cut the template.